For everyone with an interest in NASH, or more broadly, fatty liver disease, Surf's Up. Season 4, Episode 31 of Surfing the NASH Tsunami. Our slow roll into a month of exploring what we learned at EASL and ADA starts now.
Today on Surfing the NASH Tsunami.
I recently gave a presentation and I was asked to comment on drug development in a quick snapshot. The analogy that I used in a quick snapshot was the game Monopoly. I put multiple mechanism of actions on different streets and assigned the two most expensive streets to GLP-1 and FGF-21s.
I love your metaphor. But so here's the interesting thing, right? What you can't do is put Baltic on New York Avenue, which is kind of a mid-level, and declare that that's North Carolina, which is next best to Boardwalk and Park Place. Whereas here, you actually can put together a combination therapy. They talk about playing multi-dimensional speed chess. This is multi-dimensional Monopoly. You can build hotels, and then you can also build franchises of multiple different streets.
The overarching theme I'm seeing after ASLD, after EASL and ADA, is that there is drug developmental movement, there are opportunities, business opportunities, patient opportunities, and it will be able to treat fibrotic MASLD in the future. The availability of orals, GLP-1s, and data was presented in the New England back-to-back with the FGF-21 that was given as a late breaker. That just shows me that the combination of different compounds will be possible in the future, and I'm sure we'll be able to use that to reduce fibrosis burden in our patients.
These are better questions than 2019 when the question was how do we get one drug over the line. Where the definition of over the line is what do we have to do to get something to regress fibrosis. It's such a rich review. Thank you. And then I'm going to ask you my favorite question right now, which is we have to change our name because everyone tells me NASH is dead.
My name is Mazen now. Surfing the Tsunami is my first thing coming back from almost 2.5 weeks being away, so it's good to start the week like that. How long we had diabetes and obesity for, and now we're seeing things shaking. You get 25% with, forget about discontinuation and nausea and vomiting. Someone can get to 25%.
Over the last weekend in June, the EASL Congress in Vienna, Austria, and the American Diabetes Association meeting in San Diego, California, yielded exciting new information and data on major advances in drug development, non-invasive testing for steatotic liver disease, specific implementation of clinical care pathways, and major advances in AI-assisted histopathology. Throughout July, Surfing the NASH Tsunami will share insights and perspectives on all these advances. Our month of insights kicks off today in two one-on-one conversations, one between Jörn Schattenberg and Roger Green, and another between Roger and Mazen Noureddin. Listen for their thoughts on major themes and trends from the two meetings in this special episode of Surfing the NASH Tsunami.
Hi, it's Roger. Apologies for the continuing confusion about getting our post-EASL schedule going. We were planning to have a drug development discussion this week with Stephen Harrison and Mazen Noureddin, but a combination of misread time zones, bad plane flights, and a couple of communication challenges made it impossible to get everybody together in the same place. While that was going on, the more conversations I've had with people, the more I've realized what an amazing, really seminal month June of 2023 was in the history of fatty liver diseases worldwide. So here's what we're going to do. I was unable to get a call scheduled with Stephen today, but I did talk with Mazen and then separately with Jörn. I will share those conversations with you as a prelude to the month we're going to have. We will be starting next week with the 5 episodes that we talked about. A drug development conversation on Monday with Stephen, and I'm still trying to see who else can join that one. And I'll be able to share more about the schedule for the rest of the month over the course of next week. In the meantime, I think you'll learn that Mazen and Jörn each have some really fascinating things to say, and that these conversations give you some sense of the dimensions of what we're going to be talking about for the rest of the month. Hope you enjoy them, and we'll start with Mazen, and when he's done, we'll go on to Jörn. Thanks. I have the good fortune to be joined this morning by our good friend Mazen Noureddin. Mazen, how are you doing today?
Hey, Roger. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, wherever you're at.
You and I are both in good morning right now because you're back in Texas. So you left EASL. You went off on vacation with the family for a little bit, yeah?
I did. Those who are friends, they know that I have a vacation place that I hide in Spain. It's owned by my in-laws, so it's It's a free vacation on the beach. And I returned yesterday after quite a lengthy flight because I had to go to Barcelona from a city called Alicante, and I had to stay in the airport for 6 hours. So I was trying to do some work in the airport, and I got last night.
And now you're home and you're a little bit jet lagged, so it's probably afternoon for you, or else your body clock is completely off entirely. So I want to talk a little bit about what we originally were trying to do with this episode, and we'll cover some of it today. I think our audience will find it interesting. It's a little different than what we usually do on this podcast, but this conversation, I'm talking to Jörn Schattenberg a little bit later, and we'll make an episode out of this. Here's the topic. When I went to NASH in 2019 and 2020, people talked about how it was a really unique meeting. I said that what it reminded me of was some of the early meetings of something called SITC, the Society for Immunotherapy and Cancer. And before the PD-1s hit big, that was a very collegial scientific meeting of people working together to figure out how to solve an exciting and majorly important problem that didn't have an obvious solution, which was immunotherapy and cancer. And then once a lot of drugs actually came late into pipeline, the meeting got huge. Big Pharma invested heavily, and a lot of it became about competitive evaluations between drugs that were using different data with major commercial implications. And over time, that stuff sorts out. Better drugs tend to win, worse drugs tend to lose. Well, actually, earlier drugs to market have a huge advantage, but within that, agents that present a real benefit tend to win over time. What happened 2 weeks ago, I guess now, between the major drug presentations at EASL and major drug presentations at ADA, same weekend, completely different drugs, we had a range of issues start to show up, ranging from real excitement around Maestro and NASH, and oh my gosh, we might finally get a drug here, to trying to figure out how to compare what was going on with glucagon agonists and oral GLPs in San Diego to what was being reported with dual agonists and some triple agonist posters in Vienna, to trying to sort out how to compare a late breaker for one FGF-21 with what had been exciting early data for another FGF-21, to a comment from somebody I read that said that one of the things they learned was that from this meeting was that FGF-19s really have a future. So there's just a bunch of confusion going on right now. So what I'd like to talk about with you a little bit is, since you talk to as many people as anybody, some of the areas where you think all this energy is producing interesting and important questions that have to get sorted out. Why don't we start with glucagon agonists versus the world?
Sure. Let me just tell you, I guess it's a tsunami happened in the last 2 weeks, right?
Yep.
Speaking of surfing the tsunami, there have been more than one New England Journal paper related to metabolic disease, in particular obesity, as well as NASH. And interestingly, what added to the confusion is there were luckily multiple good presentations in the American Diabetes Association that talked about oral drugs or oral GLP-1s and their effect on weight loss. And many of us do not attend that meeting, or we were somewhere else. We were at EASL while the other meeting was starting, or something like that overlap. So the big news were mostly around FGF-21s and GLP-1s. Let me give you some analogy on the NASH landscape. I recently gave a presentation and I was asked to comment on drug development in a quick snapshot. The analogy that I used in a quick snapshot was the game Monopoly. You know the game, right? But although I don't like Monopoly, I put multiple mechanism of actions on different streets and assigned the two most expensive streets to GLP-1 and FGF-21s. They're expensive to buy, develop. Once you, I guess, put houses or something in them, you can get a lot back on your money. And I put different other mechanisms on different streets, like the PPRs are still very effective, genetic therapies, and many others, the novel lipogenesis and yada yada. So what we have seen, and to go back to your question about the GLP-1s, now we are seeing orals that actually lead to some weight loss that is significant. It's like more than bariatric surgery. So there's another conversation going on. Do we need bariatric surgery anymore or weight loss procedures? And I will leave that up to the endoscopist and bariatric surgeons. But what we have seen, I guess, I'm going to start butchering names because we have had so many of them. So the triple by Lilly retatrutide, I guess, or whatever you want to call it, was published in the New England Journal, and there was 25% weight reduction. This is a huge, really, really big. To be more specific, I'm still wanting to see the final or separate analysis of their fat fraction on the MRIs. But here and there, I'm being told it's up to 90% of people almost normalize their fat. Again, don't quote me yet. I still have to see the final presentation. At the same time, oral sema also achieved good weight loss. In addition, Pfizer had the opposite in use. Pfizer were developing GLP-1s, and one of their GLP-1s was actually stopped by Pfizer due to hepatotoxicity or concerns about liver safety. So the story is not final with the oral GLP-1s or dual or triple that has any GLP-1 to do with the compound. The big question or the elephant in the room is still, what do you do with fibrosis? And now let's shift the conversation a bit from the F2 to F3s and more importantly in the cirrhotics.
Retatrutide was not shared in Vienna, right? Which meant that the audience that got to see it was, A, it was an obesity study, and B, the audience that got to see it was a non-hepatology audience. So when I was looking at the New England Journal paper, one of my snap reactions was 10 to 17% discontinuation rate for retatrutide, depending on dose. And the dose that produced the 25% weight loss in 48 weeks was a 17% discontinuation rate. One of the things we know in real practice is that managing the injectable GLPs isn't as easy as people say, that, gastric issues for a significant proportion of patients are meaningful. In the efinopegdetide presentation at ADA, now they were comparing to a low dose of sema, but they showed higher gastric issues there than low dose sema for the dual agent. Triple agent had a 17% discontinuation rate at high dose. And one of the things I think we're going to wind up dealing with in real practice is, so how many patients are going to tolerate that drug anyway, right? If you get a 17 in a clinical trial where you work very, very hard at keeping people on drug, as a guy seeing patients in clinic, which I know you don't do a ton anymore, but you still do, how high does a discontinuation rate in a trial have to be for you to say, gee, that might be an issue in terms of practical patient management?
Yeah, I actually still see tons of patients. I just do it on boluses between my travels and conferences, and I have given GLP-1s. As you know, one of my biggest problem, or everyone's problems, is access. And a lot of people say, well, put that on the side. Sure, we can put that on the side in a second, and we'll go to the side effects you talked about. In addition, they're talking about the WHO making GLP-1s an essential drug and all that, and I hope it will happen. So if access is resolved, as you said, the GI side effects will be a really big issue. And especially like the higher dose you go, or the more you add to the GLP-1s like dual or triple. So that's out there. And between the nausea, vomiting, and side effects, and potentially their effect on fibrosis, the future is still wide in terms of questions. And I'll give you an example from my experience back in the days when I was a young faculty that is immature. The obeticholic acid data in NASH came out. I was writing an NIH grant, and I sat there, and my wonderful boss at that same time, she was a basic scientist, and she said, Ian, my grant was on therapeutics, and she started questioning if it will be approved, and that's the right thing to do, that they criticize your grant. And I was really worried about that grant getting funded or not. Fast forward, here we are in 2023. Unfortunately, obeticholic acid is no-go anymore. If I look back at it when I started panicking on the drug, the efficacy was good at that time, but still not enough. And same thing for NASH drugs now. We really don't see, let's give you an example. The best we have right now, we don't have more than 50% improvement in histology. So all these drugs, they still have long way to go. Now, let me comment on the GLP-1s and the side effects and all this. So the people say, well, that will seal the deal. We'll treat obesity. NASH might go away. And look at the type 2 diabetes field. There have been multiple drugs that have been developed over the years. And yet, there's more development for GLP-1 and other drugs. And diabetes is not going away, unfortunately. It's on the rise, so as obesity is on the rise. Hopefully, we'll mitigate that in the future. But I want to point out also to a publication that came out in The Lancet within the last few weeks, in addition to the New England Journal paper. And that was a meta-analysis as well as predictive model of the prevalence of type 2 diabetes in 2050. Again, 2050. And it's estimated that 1.3 billion people will have type 2 diabetes. So I go back to the initial discussions that we had as hepatologists. We do believe that the field will be not finished by one drug. The field will be very interesting in the next decade or two. You will have one drug added to another, managing the side profile effects, managing which combination is best, managing which efficacy will do best. And going back to the monopoly game that I told you, I showed that slide and I said it's up to you which street you want to buy, which one you want to put the hotel on, but it will be a wide open field that people can benefit from multiple drugs, and it depends on their portfolio. And finally, I put in a subsequent slide, I highlighted the go to jail guy, and I said the go to jail in our field will be liver biopsy. It will set you back, it'll put you back in jail here and there. You have to get out of it, and we have come out of it, and we have had positive phase 3 study as discussed, but it will be a major hurdle, especially with the inter-intra-observer variabilities and other issues that we have discussed in previous episodes.
So let me go to monopoly for a second, because I love your metaphor. You and I had not talked about this before we got on this interview, so I love it. But so here's the interesting thing, right? In monopoly, for example, a drug class might be Boardwalk and Park Place, and another one might be Mediterranean Baltic, which I guess is the cheap end. But what you can't do is put Baltic on New York Avenue, which is kind of a mid-level, and declare that that's North Carolina, which is next best to Boardwalk and Park Place. Whereas here, you actually can put together a combination therapy that's, one part THR beta and one part FXR or whatever else. And maybe that's the combination where a single drug gets you over your 50% mark. So if you will, they talk about playing multidimensional speed chess. This is multidimensional monopoly. You can build hotels, and then you can also build franchises of multiple different streets.
Well, obviously, you know Monopoly very well, and you know the street names very well. So I forgot them. And not to mention that I grew up in a different country, so we had the streets names were different. Though I know like the name of the streets very well.
I go to Atlantic City from time to time. I live an hour from there, so I know all those street names really well. And for those who don't know, that's where Monopoly is based on.
Cool. So again, like it will be like a lot of pharma owing a lot of assets here and there, and I bet you in the future, and we're seeing it already, a lot of bigger pharma, they are owning big products now, like GLP-1 in addition to the FGF-21s. Thyroid hormone beta receptor is very attractive as well. We still have to see it combined with other agents, and especially it will make hopefully the first FDA approval, and it will be up to I just don't want to see it people also from commercial and assets kind of concept, the monopoly. It's also, as a physician, I will have multiple drugs in my hand that I will combine both of them. And we go back to that when one of episodes like a year or two ago. What is the patient? Is he F2 or F3? And eventually cirrhotic. Which one I will combine? How does the patient look like? Does he have GERD? Does he have IBS? Does he have constipation? Which are not uncommon side effects. And eventually, I think there will be multiple sensitivity analysis related to BMI, related to gender, related to many other things. So it's just like we have to know the landscape, and this, as you said, go back to the monopoly, which streets you want to combine and which things that work best.
So the only other thought I had listening to you was my favorite moment in the Maestro NASH presentation was someone asked Stephen about liver volume, and his answer was, yeah, there's a liver volume effect here. We don't know exactly yet what it's related to. It may be inflammation, but you couldn't predict the amount of liver volume change simply based on the metrics that we know how to use. So I think there are things we just don't know about yet, right? There's what we know, there's what we don't know. To change metaphors, the sun is starting to break through the clouds, but it's still pretty dark and soupy out there, and there's a lot that we've yet to see.
Yeah, and I'll throw an example. What would TH beta does with GLP-1? What would it do with FGF-21s? Would the fibrosis be different if you had these combination? As you know, like resmetirom has achieved like very significant endpoints despite the biopsy hurdles. We had NASH resolution, we had fibrosis improvement, we had both, and NITs moved the same directions. So that was outstanding. At the same time as like the bicosoffermin data was presented and was published in the New England Journal or appeared online during the meeting, which was cool. And we started hearing other questions: is people trying to compare bicosoffermin to efruxifermin? And indeed, there are actually other FGF-21s in the pipelines. For example, Boston Pharma, they have a very attractive FGF-21 that is probably going to be less frequently injected. And the question in the future, we're going to compare across this class in terms of GI side effects, as well as the antibody formation story is not out yet. So especially if you use it for a longer time. So we'll see that in the future as well. But what I want to mention about the bicosoffermin efruxifermin versus efruxifermin, there were multiple questions, which one is better? And I think this is really, I want to caution people really hard on that comparison. I want to remind people an example of obeticholic acid. When it came out first initially, it showed NASH resolution, which did not show in the follow-up studies. So having these two drugs and trying to put the figures next to each other and try to calculate the delta and which delta is better, and I caution people to do that. Look at the drug, look at its specificities, pegylated or not pegylated, GI side effects within that drug, but we really cannot make final decision which more is more efficacious than the other unless if we could do head-to-head comparison. I mean, a lot of people are like, efruxifermin is more effective because of that higher bar. The other people is like, well, the delta, and look at that. So I caution people to look at that.
So Mazen, here's the other complication. While we're throwing metaphors, I love monopoly. I hadn't heard it before, but one I've been using for 20 years in different settings is that it's best to think of big pharma these days as being like Hollywood. Hollywood has basically stopped making creative movies, but they're so strong at marketing and distribution and finance that after you've made your brilliant creative movie, you need Hollywood to get it to 200 screens in America on the same weekend and nominated for Academy Awards and all that. But what Hollywood really likes most is sequels. So they don't know how to value the first property, but they do know what Rocky 7 is going to be worth as compared to Ant-Man 4, right?
Okay.
So if you think of that in the big pharma context, what people are trying to do right now is value new properties, because we don't have Rocky yet. Forget Rocky 7. We don't have Rocky. We don't have Star Wars. We don't have any of those things. And people are trying to figure out, so which is the franchise that's really going to work? And it leads to exactly what you just described, which is, now we'll take all these metaphors together. So I've now decided as a commercial guy that the property called FGF-21 is really valuable. Maybe that's Boardwalk and Park Place. Maybe. Okay. But then I have to decide which one is Boardwalk and which one is Park Place. And I don't really have a way within the class to make that comparison because we don't know yet. But the bet I'm about to make is tens of billions of dollars if I'm going to acquire a company. So that's really easy if I've got to value Rocky 4 off Rocky 3. It's very hard if I have to value Rocky 1 as compared to some other movie that looks the same in the script but turns out to be a complete bomb.
Yeah, if I understood you correctly, the only difference I see that, and I don't know if I misunderstood you, I think we do have novelties here and a lot of innovative drugs. Mm-hmm. How long we had diabetes and obesity for, and now we're seeing like things shaking. Like, you get 25% with, forget about discontinuation and nausea and vomiting. Someone can get to 25%.
Someone can drop 54 pounds in a year and keep them off if they stay on the drug.
We haven't seen that for decades. We have novel mechanisms. Like, you would think, well, the endocrinologists did think that TH-betas can do something. It was mainly directed to the lipids. And now, like, you have these innovative mechanisms that actually target the liver. And FGF-21s, they came after, we looked at the 19s and now the 21s. So I think we have great steps, great innovations, like genetic therapies, not even touching base on them, like the HSD17 or PNLP3. We're still reading stories. So what I'm trying to say here is that it's an exciting time, really. Where I see that we took a lot of hit is the assessment that we have right now. Again, I'm not trying to point fingers to anyone, especially to the regulators. The regulators have to be objective and go with the best evidence, which is the liver biopsy. And our job is to show them, and we have been building the case. Like right now, if you go to the regulator and say, hey, Brunt and colleagues showed that ballooning cell is impossible to agree on. The inter and intra-observer variabilities are impossible. I think the answer is like, yeah, we do agree, but give us the evidence that we can move on, and we can talk about that at another time. The novelty and the big movies, as you said, they're coming out. I think it's just the way we're assessing them. And I bet you in the future, once we move to the NITs as a valid way for assessment, and we're already seeing that you see more effect in the liver and other parts of the body rather than liver biopsy alone.
I want to have you back when we do this episode. We're going to do another episode later this month where if we can get it on your amazing schedule, I would love to have you join us, because one of the things that struck me in the meeting completely off this point is that we use this phrase AI machine learning, and we use it to describe everything from what you pull out of an EHR database to identify patients we should be screening that we're not, to how do we apply this to clinical trials, to what can we learn actually about the liver in terms of, which drugs affect which regions of the liver and how. And all that's available to us. We call all of it AI. We throw it into one bucket, and people get very confused when they use those terms also. It's like wherever you look on the landscape right now, there's a lot of progress and it's all still shrouded in fog. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
When we come back to this issue, we're going to do 1 or 2 drug development episodes this month coming out of the various conferences. One is going to be to take a look at what's in the short term versus what it might mean in the long term, right? We saw a really interesting FASN inhibitor presentation. We saw the first genetic medicine presentation, the alnylam Regeneron drug, and there's a long way to go on that. But I know, for example, I think it's AstraZeneca has a PNPLA3 target and HSN1713 target, both in mid to late stage clinical development. So all this stuff is going to start happening really fast, faster than people can keep track of it. And I guess when we put this episode together, one of the hopes was to dive into a couple of these issues specifically, FGF-21 being one, the glucagon agents being a second, and then maybe cross-class comparisons being a third, and asking, so what do we really know now? And what do we think we know, but maybe we don't?
Oh, I can tell you it's really exciting.
Yeah.
I need to send you that slide, the Monopoly slide.
Which, if you have rights to it, we'll post on our website when we post this episode so everyone can see it. I guess the question I'm going to start asking, and it just came up as you and I were talking, is what does this mean to me if I'm evaluating drugs for investment? What rules should I be using right now to figure out what's worth investing in? And if I'm a clinician, what should I be getting excited about?
There's a lot to get excited about.
Yeah, it's the frightening thing, right? You get excited about all of it and just not know yet what's going to matter most.
Yeah, we have hopefully the first drug to be approved, hopefully by 2024. Mm-hmm. We have other drugs chasing that drug that they look quite efficacious, like the FGF-21s, the GLP-1s, and others. And there are also precision medicine coming on the way that you alluded to already.
And then, as you mentioned, there's PPARs. You mentioned that earlier. Their data's been pretty compelling, and they're in phase 3.
Yeah, the lanifibranor looks really good, and their trial is ongoing. And again, it's the glass half full. At the same time, we have this liver biopsies is holding us back, and we'll see how the future look like. But you can predict that with more data that we're producing, that the future of these clinical trials will be on steroids, or will be really fast once we get to the non-invasive testing. Like obesity trials, like they're much easier to do than a NASH trial. And we will get there. It's just we're showing the evidence. What the clinicians need to know is that everything comes with a price. We're paying now the price of liver biopsy and other things. And eventually these patients need to be managed. If you're losing 25% of weight that we have not seen in decades, there's a price for that, the nausea and vomiting and other GI side effects. And guess what? Those are GI doctors that they know how to manage that. They just need to get more comfortable with managing other medications, such as type 2 medications. And they don't have to do it alone. They have to do it with an endocrinologist.
Yeah, I was going to say, so the question Ken Kuzi always asks on our Rising Tide series is, when are my hepatologist colleagues going to start acting more like endocrinologists, start prescribing GLP-1s in the same way that they're asking endocrinologists to act more like hepatologists?
Yeah, I mean, we have done that previously between ID and hepatologist with the interferon and ribavirin. And interferon was injectable, had a lot of side effects, and both ID and hepatology managed that. In addition, I also want to point out to the IBD drugs. IBD drugs, they have, which you can think about the FGF-21s. The IBD drugs, they have antibodies issues, they have injectables, they have side effects. And the GI docs, actually, they're used to it as well, or most of them are. Or at least, like, eventually, it could be, even within GI and hepatology, the management could be separated in 2 tiers, like first-line NASH drugs, that they are easier to use and could be less efficacious, and eventually, like, more efficacious NASH drugs that they just refer if they are not having any response to hepatologists, and we manage. I don't know. I'm just making that up on the go, but there are multiple possibilities that the future can bring.
So with all that, thanks for your time this morning, and I'd love to have you over the next month. We're going to be reviewing what's been a remarkable month. I mean, I think everybody came out of EASL with their heads spinning. There was just so much there on so many different dimensions.
Yeah, indeed.
One of the episodes from EASL, someone described it as a coming out party for Yale and IT, something I know near and dear to your heart. And that's all about non-invasive testing, having nothing to do with drugs per se, except in the sense we're talking about in this conversation. There's going to be a ton over the next month as we talk about everything to digest from EASL and with an assist from San Diego. But I think this conversation and the 1 or 2 others I'm going to have today will be great in giving people just a broad sense of understanding what we can be confident we do know versus what we don't know yet, but we're really going to be excited to learn versus what we haven't even figured out how we're going to learn yet. Thanks for your time this morning.
Good to have you, especially like surfing the tsunami is my first thing coming back from almost 2.5 weeks being away. So it's good to start the week like that.
Thank you. And then I'm going to ask you my favorite question right now, which is, we have to change our name because everyone tells me Nash is dead.
My name is Mazel now.
So just to give a little hint, the interesting thing about mazel is it sounds like muscle, right?
Yeah, so we're debating that, and there is a task force. So as you know, it's going between mazeled and masled, and I think we're leaning more toward masled, but of course people will name it differently. So it's masled and mash. We're having too much fun in this field.
I know. And in the middle of that, we're learning a whole bunch of stuff at the same time. Thank you for your time today, my friend. I look forward to talking to you soon. And
Absolutely.
Okay. Bye-bye now.
Bye.
So, having had our conversation with Mazen, which you just heard, I'm now here with my good friend and co-host, Jörn Schattenberg. Jörn, I guess it's afternoon for you, and it's still morning for me. Usually when I talk to you, it's evening, but I guess this is afternoon, hey?
Yeah, hi, Roger. Yeah, it's a little bit untypical time for me. I just took off my tie, and I guess you normally don't see me with one, but trying to be a European with style, I wear them during the day.
Yeah, Europeans do that, and actually, I saw you with a tie the entire EASL conference. Every time I saw you, you had a tie on. So I can vouch to the quality of your cravats, if you will. So everything in this podcast starts with you and Louise and me. Louise is still, I think, in transit and didn't get to attend much of the conference. And what we're talking about today really are more issues of drug development and NITs, more commercial issues, things I think that are closer to your wheelhouse than hers. So what I want to do is I want to pick up on some of the things we didn't cover with Mazen and then talk more broadly about helping our audience. One of the things I've noticed as I've been speaking with folks is between what happened in Vienna and what happened in San Diego and what published in New England Journal and what published in Lancet, an awful lot of people are trying to figure out what next. Like we've had this deluge of information. Really, I think the richest conference in terms of information that I remember in this space. And promise that it's only going to get more so over time. For today, let's start our review of the month by looking at some of the drug development issues and some of the possible confusions. And then just generally, what are you hearing and what are you thinking you should talk to people? Let's dive into the aftermath of Mazen's conversation. You noted before I turned the recording on that there were a couple things in that conversation that you wanted to follow up on. So why don't you just pick one and dive in?
Yeah, thank you. You also said we should look at the big picture, and that's so exciting at this time. There's so many things happening in parallel. It's unbelievable. We had EASL and ADA meetings in parallel. So while I was trying to Twitter about late-breaking data in the EASL on resolution of NASH and defattening of the liver, there was actually presentations detailing weight loss GLP-1 dual agonists at the ADA. So I think something we're seeing here is those fields are even moving closer, or the people that are interested in treating metabolic dysfunction-associated steatotic liver disease are dipping in multiple ponds. We're looking at the diabetes treatment. The same drugs might have some efficacy in the liver realm. And the question is, how will we use them wisely? Who will use them? And how do we manage side effects? And this is something that came out very strongly out of Jörn and Mazen's conversation.
One of the things that really struck me is that the retatrutide study actually looked at obese non-diabetic patients, right? So really, it's almost as if diabetes, obesity, and NASH are related, closely related metabolic syndromes, but each one can get looked at in a vacuum as well, or aside from the other two, really.
Yeah, and we have different endpoints that the regulators are agreeing to. So I think that's in the drug development arena, the crucial difference here. What I was going to say is that something that will for sure stay in the hepatology arena is the management of patients with advanced and cirrhotic liver disease. So far, we've seen one F4 study exploring GLP-1 in these patients. It was a small phase 2 study that I co-authored. We presented at EASL last year, I believe. It was the SEMA F4 study where there was no improvement of liver histology over the time course of the treatment. And albeit being a smaller study, the drug did show the efficacy on weight loss, improvement, A1C, all the things you'd expect from SEMA 2.4. And then, what does it tell us? One of the overarching themes I'm seeing in the field is that even if we achieve weight loss, it might not be the only treatment that you might need for a metabolically diseased patient with severe liver disease. There's a number of studies I'd like to recapitulate to back that. The first one is the Cuban study where they did weight loss in a lot of patients. I believe it was 300 patients, 52 weeks and paired biopsies. And they had fibrosis resolution with a 5% weight loss, but not everybody that lost 5% did have fibrosis regression. So there is inconsistency. Then there was no cirrhotics involved. And there was a French study that did bariatric surgery, and they, after follow-up, did not see that all cirrhotics reverted or fibrosis was improved in every patient, albeit weight loss seen in the bariatric arena. And I can just tell from my clinic, last week I saw a patient that lost 50 kilograms after bariatric surgery, and now 5 years out, she's 70 kilos, down from 120. She had ascites for the first time, decompensation of underlying cirrhosis. So there might be more than just we have to cut off the weight.
Well, I think we know there's more, right? As I said, I thought one of the interesting comments that came out of Vienna was Stephen taking a question, if I recall correctly, on liver volume with resmetirom and saying, well, yeah, there's an effect, and you can't explain that simply by the other things that we know to look at. Something else must be going on there, which could be THR beta specific or not, although it's the only place we know we've seen it yet. So, yeah, I think the liver will keep telling us that it's more complex than we realize.
Agree, and it might, let's put it that way, the changes are not as rapid as you might see weight loss with some of those highly effective drugs, and that's clearly big and good news for a lot of patients suffering from obesity. That also causes a lot of other end organ injury, including skeletal bones, knees, back, and stigma.
True, but then, as I said, I think I mentioned this in the conversation with Mazen. I was struck by how high the discontinuation rates were in the retatrutide study, and it struck me because so much effort is made in these studies to keep patients in, right? That a patient in typical practice will not get the same attention to keep them on drug, particularly if they're not being treated by a researcher, but merely by a physician with 15 minutes per visit. So even when these drugs are great solutions, they won't be great solutions for everybody. And I think that's true of every drug that's ever been developed, virtually regardless of disease.
I agree. And let me add the complexity of the scaling up, so the dose escalation themes, which are very minutely controlled and regulated in clinical trials. And this is probably the answer on how to manage GI side effects. You can probably go slower or de-escalate, and then if it's tolerated, go slow and increase the dose again. But that adds complexity too. And I realized that when I had a patient and they were looking at the pen and they had to turn and twist, and then they were looking for what number is this, it's error prone. So it's not an easy treatment, right? I think we agree here, and management of side effects will be very crucial moving forward.
So what I find so interesting about all this is that it's clear how complex all this will be. And yet, they say in the desert, any drink of water is as good as any other drink. So you could almost, in some ways, view MASH treatment as the desert right now, right? We just had this mirage called obeticholic acid, which now appears to have disappeared for the last time. We have this apparent waterhole called resmetirom, which we're approaching rapidly. They announced they've begun their rolling submission at their NDA. And then off in the horizon, we have lots of other things that look like they might be palm trees, communities, streams of bountiful water and lush fruit, use the metaphor of your choice. But we haven't gone there yet. And you get the sneaking suspicion that none of it's going to be quite as pristine as it feels, which is what you're talking about when you talk about side effects and how do patients actually manage a pen and all those things.
Yeah, I agree. As a MASH nerd, I'm very excited because of all the potential opportunities and treatment combinations that I have in mind. We don't know if all these drugs will be pursued in that indication, whether we'll see the readouts. I would recommend the producers and drug developers to actually look at the liver as one of the crucial organs and one of the organs with an agreed approval pathway here, and increasing the available non-invasive tests that can give you positive signals. And I think Mazen commented on those. But then on the other hand, we don't know whether they'll all be going into that liver arena. And for now, we have, I agree, the waterhole, using the analogy of the desert, because we've seen positive phase 3 data and a good safety profile. That is for sure something that is good news for our liver patients. And this has, led to a momentum. And I think that's the overarching theme I'm seeing after AASLD, after EASL and ADA, is that there is drug developed for mental movement. There are opportunities, business opportunities, patient opportunities, and it I think we'll be able to treat fibrotic MASLD in the future.
Listening to you for 3 sentences, I'm also struck by the idea that the change in nomenclature is at the beginning, not hardly at the end. You went from being a MASH nerd to talking about the change in MASLD in the span of about 25 words, and both are appropriate descriptors, but I don't think we figured out what anybody's going to call any of this yet, really. The Global Liver Institute came out with an interesting statement yesterday that they are not going to change the nomenclature they use until September 5th, because by then they hope to have their own impact assessment done if nobody else has. And while I appreciate the benefit of the name change, I think the critique of not having an impact assessment is accurate, that we don't know, Ken Cusi made the comment in our last Rising Tide podcast that having taken a year to get everybody on board the idea that you have these NASH clinical pathways, he wished he could have had a year to use the name NASH to socialize the clinical care pathways before the name got changed. And ironically, the guys who drove this, which is a puzzle, aren't accepting the new name change anyway. So we've got all this uncertainty at once, right? We've got uncertainty around drugs. We've got a nomenclature change that we've got to bring in. And I guess the third piece is testing. As you pointed out, Mazen made the point in our conversation that getting to NITs is going to be huge.
Just as a follow-up to the nomenclature, I think it started as an academic debate, and it has been a thorough process among experts. I'm worried about GLI not being aligned here, and I think it'll be important to use the consensus that has been developed among this Delphi process to come back to common grounds again. But on the other side, we're still talking about the same patients, right? So nothing has changed. I'm seeing a patient with metabolic risk factors with severe advanced liver disease, and I want to offer treatment to them. I am worried that we'll be sidetracked and a lot of energy that has already been spent on this and even more energy might be lost. The good news is the momentum in the drug development arena is there, and we'll use that for the benefit of our patients.
I agree with that. And at this point, as far as nomenclature goes, I'm not concerned about being sidetracked. I think that's avoidable. I think the critique that's got value is that the academics are not the treaters and they're not the patients. So we're going to need for people to act with motivation and energy to figure out how to do the translation on this. Now, the good news is, to go back to your comment on drug development, I've got to believe, although I've not spoken to anybody there about this specifically, that Madrigal is as motivated as anybody in the world right now, literally, to get this communication right, because they're the people who are going to have to explain to doctors who they want to be treating using whatever nomenclature you use, and it's going to be the new nomenclature. So I believe that the burden will wind up falling on the commercial interests and the patient advocates to do the translation. They may not be happy about it, but I don't think they're going to wind up having a choice.
It's just to revisit the thought of how to identify the patients. I mean, the nomenclature was, I think part of it was that we get rid of that negative definition where we have to identify a disease based on that it's not caused by something else. And I think clinicians in primary care will accept that there is a metabolic patient at risk, and that was where also the MAFLD definition came from, that develops liver disease. But moving on and discussing NITs, as you said, clearly that's also the second most exciting momentum we've seen. Revisiting EASL there for a second, we had a large number of presentations from the nail NIT. There was litmus presentations still. We've seen diagnostic biomarkers, a change under treatment. There's a poster I was presenting with for efruxifermin. This is clearly the tools that we have developed over the last years that are lined up ready to be used by non-expert hepatologists to identify the patients at risk and also monitor their treatment, I think, in the future. So clearly, the NIT story is something that allows us to speak about management of patients with new drugs.
I think you're right, and I think that'll be vastly helpful. In terms of the regulators, those are going to be different challenges. Regulators were still stuck for the time being with ordinal histopathology.
Absolutely.
Which could kindly be described as a blunt instrument. I think so. One of the things we also saw emerge in Vienna that I commented on, I think on our last podcast episode you weren't on, is we use this phrase AI in so many different ways. But even if we limit it to the use of AI in cleaning up the drug approval process, the question becomes, is what we're trying to do simply reduce the variance around reads using the same ordinal histopathology measures that we've always used, which feels like it's kind of the path AI approach, or AIM path approach? Or are we trying in the process to improve knowledge? And does that belong in the drug approval process, or does that belong outside the bounds of that? We did this extra, so you were part of, with Arun and David, about the study that they're doing with histo right now, which I believe will probably report out at AASLD, which is a very, very rigorous look at all that. But in the end, how will that affect approvals versus the overall development of drug knowledge? I don't know. I'm not smart enough to know the answer to that question. But
you're very smart, Roger. You're being polite enough to trying to lure me into a definite answer here. I guess the way you were thinking about AI is liver histology assessment, and that's an augmentation of which we see a number of technologies, both looking at the categorical stages of the NASH CRN to support regulatory drug approval, but also interesting novel aspects. And I presented this in a different abstract at EASL, something that was called Q-vessel, looking at the vessels within a liver biopsy as patients progress to cirrhosis. We saw changes in the architecture there, which is not surprising, but we're able to identify them and quantitate them. And I think that's where, from an academic perspective, we'll end up with ways to generate hypotheses and maybe even develop a better understanding of this disease as long as we have liver histology available. So I'm excited for it for both terms from the liver histology perspective. But the next layer is that we also use that in, let's say, labs, clinical notes, and actually identify patients at risk for the future. And we've done quite some time ago, the NASH map algorithm was discussed on this podcast, and that paper is published by now. So you can use AI in all different contexts of use to support the management, the identification, and in the end, treatment response prediction. And for that, I think it's a very interesting theme.
In the end, obviously, as you point out correctly, biopsy will help us learn something as long as they're biopsies. And frankly, there are decades of unstained biopsy slides that anybody who can work with an unstained slide can go back and develop a really rich trove of available data. Once you stain it, you change it, obviously, so that's problematic. Ultimately, from the presentations you saw in NITs, do you have a vision of how all that might develop in clinical use? How will we ask doctors to use NITs, say 5 years from now, to treat and evaluate patients? Did you see papers that gave you a sense of how that's going to work?
So my clinical perspective is to implement these type of changes in the diagnostic arena will take quite a long time. And physicians will use their traditional liver enzymes to probably assess if a patient gets better, looking at treatment start and then on treatment ALT changes, and we might be able to classify patients that respond rapidly or more delayed based on that pattern on liver enzymes. And then, of course, they're going to be more advanced NITs. The question is, are those reimbursed and do I have access? And that's the most pressing part here, because we're not going to see uniform adaptations throughout healthcare systems, coverage by payers. So my assumption is that unless a drug is linked to a certain NIT through the label, let's say a response prediction that's dictated by the regulators, we'll see very diverse aspects on how to assess MASLD, and a lot of it will be imaging based, but we'll also see use of very plain liver enzymes on treatment.
Interesting. When you say imaging based, are you envisioning a lot more use of VCTE or subsequent generations of VCTE-like technology, or are you going all the way to MRE, MRI?
So it's probably going to be ultrasound-based technologies assessing attenuation and velocity being calculated into elastography in a certain machine, and there could be multiple of them.
What else of all that you saw last month really got your attention?
So obviously, having attended Vienna, I felt the treatment aspects were very exciting, in particular as looping back to the therapy session, we saw so many different MOAs. There was the siRNA knockdown. There was a dual agonist. We had obviously the thyroid hormone receptor beta, and this is just a lot of MOAs we're seeing here. I'm not all made it, but I'm very excited about the genetic approaches because I find this is novel and something that has been already implemented if you think about the PCSK9 inhibitors. So that is exciting. But then again, at the same time, the availability of orals GLP-1s and data was presented in the New England back-to-back with the FGF-21 that was given as a late breaker. That just shows me that the combination of different compounds will be possible in the future, and I'm sure we'll be able to use that to reduce fibrosis burden in our patients.
Well, and after hearing for years about the FASN inhibitors, I think denifenstat showed up with a significant amount of data for the first time.
Right, so that was the next one. Yep. For the longest time, we talked about PPARs, and now the phase 3 lanifibranor is enrolling, and they're kind of in a data hole a little bit, but that doesn't mean that drug has disappeared. So I think also that MOA is still valid in a total different indication, and the fibranor re-emerged actually in the context of PBC. So also that drug class is something to keep in mind because they, again, seem very safe, positive metabolic profiles, and if they hit both endpoints in phase 3, that's going to be very good news.
Well, and Lani certainly in phase 2 was a lot more promising than Ella was in NASH. As you point out, the Ella phase 3 in PBC is pretty exciting, and you have the CMB compound, which is also in phase 3 in PBC, which also looks promising.
I didn't want to sidetrack us, but we have the PPARs in the back end, and we haven't seen too much about those in the NASH arena here. So I think that is exciting. Beyond that, again, the momentum to have these communities, endocrinologists, diabetologists, hepatologists, seeing the same drug classes being explored should really help us to move together and act united for the best of our patients.
I don't think PPARs are sidetracked, because here's the interesting thing. Going back to mirages and deserts and shiny objects or lush fruit trees 50 miles off in the distance, the reality is right now we have resmetirom, and if clinical trial progression is linear and things work more or less the way you predict based on where everything sits today, Lani is second up. So when we think about the practical evolution of the treatment of the disease in the hands of clinicians as compared to what's exciting in the research horizon, you really can't overlook PPARs. And you're right. Right now, Lani is the only one in late-stage development for this indication, and there wasn't a lot of new Lani data in this meeting. We might not have given them that attention, but they look like they come up second.
Yes, they'll come. I mean, there are more phase 3 programs. The thing is, if you have an approved drug on the market like Sema, you can produce additional data from that without talking about your indication of NASH, which you can't do, obviously, if you're pursuing it in a drug development program. So that's a little tricky, but more things to come.
Well, the other interesting thing to me is that there was a lot more excitement about the GLP-1 GIP agonists a while back, and now less on that, right? People don't talk much about tirzepatide, tirzepatide got, I guess, discontinued, and a lot more interest in the GLP-1 glucagon agonists, the duals.
Yeah, I think reason being, of course, the glucagon receptor being liver specific, you expect more liver specific MOAs, and with all the GLP-1s, we only have indirect metabolic effects that would benefit the liver. So I think that is one reason, and I don't see a study program for tirzepatide in fibrotic NASH. So clearly, the mechanism of glucagon receptor agonism, and we see a number of compounds that differ with regards to the affinity to those subreceptors, is something that I'll be interested in. I'm more prominent in that class. But then also the triple agonist was recently presented, right?
Right. So as we're speaking, I'm actually scrolling through the Eli Lilly clinical pipeline webpage. And they report that they have tirzepatide studies in phase 2 in NASH, but really that's it. Retatrutide is in phase 2 in obesity, not in NASH. They don't really talk a lot, right? Well, they've got a PNPLA3 siRNA in phase 1 for NASH, but for all the excitement that Lilly produced about obesity and all the conversation about what that's going to mean for NASH and the future of NASH, I don't see, at least on this page right now, an awful lot of evaluation of those drugs in that indication from Lilly, at least. I can't speak for the rest of the world. You know more than I do because this is a world you live a lot closer to than me. Altimmune and Merck presented on phase 2A and 2B NASH studies in one session in Vienna. Is anybody else with a dual agonist or treble agonist presenting in NASH right now?
So there's a dual agonist developed by Boehringer Ingelheim and Zealand Pharma, actually, and they have cooperated on that, and the data presented at ADA in San Diego, and they have a NASH program that has been enrolled in phase 2. So we'll see where that goes. Many, again, those GLP-1 glucagon receptor agonists are going to be different based on efficacy and tolerability, and the determinant is how strong are they binding to the respective receptors.
Actually, that's interesting. I guess that's right. So phenopegdetide, which Merck presented, is in fact the Hanmi phase 2 that Hanmi has been posting on forever, which is fast-tracked. I believe they've got a treble also, although I didn't see any signs of it in this meeting. So I could just be wrong about that. But it's an exciting area. What else did you notice in Vienna?
Let's revisit the patient pathways. And you said Ken Kusi has been complaining about the nomenclature that might water that line.
I wouldn't say complaining. I would say he was wistful. Ken doesn't complain. Ken's one of the most optimistic people I know. I'd say he was wistful.
He adapts and develops solutions. I saw a lot of posters on, again, NIT-based identification and referral pathways. And if we leave the name behind for a second, or the acronym, we could say that we define patients based on their NIT pattern. And there was some presentations on that: referral, FIB4 follow-up, or primary testing with a direct fibrosis marker. And that, in the end, if you educate our peers on a marker that's available in their pathway and they can use it to identify a patient at risk of advanced liver disease, then we can focus more on the advanced disease stages, call them liver patients because that's what they are in the presence or absence of obesity, and then focus on the management of these patients. So I think that's also important to not lose the focus with all the many patients affected by metabolic dysfunction-associated steatotic liver disease, that we really want the ones with advanced fibrosis, and a drug will have to show efficacy in that arena to really move the needle in terms of prognosis. And that's at least my belief.
That makes a lot of sense to me, particularly given that we've seen work with SEMA, right, in NASH that's had tremendous effect on, it's been able to move NAS scores, but not yet fibrosis.
That's also my answer to the thought that by cutting body weight in everybody, will that cure all liver disease? And I think we said that once or twice here. This might not be the case for all patients. For sure, it will be beneficial, in particular in earlier stages, but I would rather have an anti-fibrotic or an effective drug that halts fibrosis progression, decreases the amount of decompensation, and reverses fibrosis. I think we discussed treatment, NITs, referral pathways a little bit. What else was there? I think an overall big unity on wanting to move the field forward in terms of nomenclature, in terms of identifying patients, and a big debate, maybe if we move to the next level, screening for complications, that's still unanswered.
But boy, I have to tell you, these are better questions than 2019 when the question was, how do we get one drug over the line? Where the definition of over the line is, what do we have to do to get something to regress fibrosis? It's such a richer view. And I agree with you that the RNA knockdowns are a fascinating issue.
Those move us a little bit more closer to personalized therapies and remove the discussion around just moving fat or metabolic burden out of the patient. And again, one of the workshops I had with Elisabetta Bugianesi was on lean NAFLD, and then particularly in that patient population where we kind of see the disconnect between the classical obese patients and the severity of liver disease. This could could be, of course, a fascinating story.
Well, it's going to be an important story because, as I think I've commented, that progresses faster and in terms of short-term investment, it costs the healthcare system more, short-term spend, because it's a faster path. Although 4 years ago, people believed that from every stage to every next stage of fibrosis was 7 years, regardless of patient. Now we're saying 4 years in diabetes from F3 to F4, which makes that far more urgent, frankly, because 4 years might not sound like a lot, but 4 years ago is when you and I started talking. So,
the truth is a lot of those lean NAFLD patients are excluded from clinical trials based on the inclusion of BMI above 25 and more. And if you look at the weight loss medications, typically they're even higher, 28 or even 30. So,
are there any trials looking at lean NASH right now in drugs?
I'm not aware. I think most limit the BMI to the lower order of obesity or being obese.
So with all that, we're going to take an edited version of this conversation and Mazen's and maybe one more and post them today or tomorrow. We'll be back on Monday with Stephen and hopefully one other person talking specifically about some drug development issues. And then we will dive into the rest of the month, NITs and clinical care pathways and all the amazing information that came forward. It's an exciting time to be working in this space, I got to tell you. I've decided when we go up with a new website, we're going to have MASH Nerd as your title.
It's the same excitement here. Incredible to be a person being able to ride this wave or sit on this beach, if you like, and very exciting to our future discussions around it.
I kind of like that we can sit on the beach watching people ride the wave. Now, of course, we have to do that with hot coffee. We can't have alcohol.
Coffee's good enough. Thank you, Roger.
I think so. Thank you, my friend. I will see you Monday. Have a great weekend, okay? Bye-bye now.
And now for the Season 4, Episode 31 Business Report.
Slava Ukraini, Heroyam Slava. Glory to Ukraine, glory to heroes. With the EASL episodes not having business reports in them, I feel like it's been a month since we've done one of these. Probably has, actually. During that time, we've had our interview with Tatiana Deshko in episode 28, but we missed the entire news story around the Wagner Group rebellion, the increased Russian shelling in Ukrainian cities like Lviv, and the limited news that's been available around the Ukrainian counteroffensive. Sometimes a quiet news period means all the important stories are lying underneath the surface. I'm sure that's the case here. Let's hope Ukraine gets the material it needs to sustain the ongoing counteroffensive and live up to Tatiana's dream of all of us celebrating one day in a peaceful and jubilantly victorious Ukraine. Slava Ukraini.
Thanks for sticking with us through a period of scheduling challenges.
When I started this podcast 3 years ago, I was told the most important key to success was to post consistently, same day, same time, every week. Until the last 2 months, we've done pretty well with that. June and July have been frankly kind of choppy. We anticipate getting back to a more regular schedule within the next couple of weeks. In the meantime, listener numbers have stayed strong, with June being our second month over 10,000 downloads in our history and Q2 being our second best quarter ever. Thanks for your loyalty. We appreciate having you with us.
It was Shakespeare who asked, "What's in a name?"
We're working now to reconsider our brand name, brought about largely by the Nomenclature Conference, but also by our desire and your request that we expand our information offerings. I'll provide more on this in the weeks ahead.
The vault is back. Details to follow.
Over the next month, we will include 1 or 2 Vault episodes each week, looking back to past conference wrap-ups on similar topics. This weekend, we will have a piece from Mazen on Saturday and a piece from Jörn on Sunday, possibly a summary of some ADA drug conversations on Rising Tide as well. And with that, I'm off till next week. Thanks to Jörn and Mazen for 2 great conversations and their flexibility in scheduling, to Magic Mike for producing this on the fly, and a special thanks to Jake, now settling into his new home in Australia, who said he missed the podcast and wanted to help out even on what was supposed to be a vacation week, which helped us get this done. Enjoy your weekend. We'll see you again next week to discuss drug development stories from EASL and ADA. Bye-bye now.
Have any questions for the surfers? You can send them to surfingnash.com, and we will answer on the podcast or the website.